Okay, year 10. So you have now finished your reading of both sources, and you should have an idea of how much time you have left over out of that 15 minutes. So for me, it took about 10 minutes to read both of those articles. So I've got 5 minutes left now to do some planning before approaching the questions. So, what I would suggest in terms of your planning, you're not going to be able to do very much, but it's good just to take a few notes on the following three things. So, the first is the subject that the articles are about. This is really, really easy. So both articles are about cycling and about drivers. So I've just made a very, very quick note in case it's not obvious that both of these articles are about cycling or cyclists and the drivers that they encounter. What you then should do, and this will really, really help you out for question number 4, is just make a quick note on the writer's perspective, so their viewpoint towards the subject they have written about. So at the top here, I've just made a note that the writer's perspective is that cyclists are at risk due to inconsiderate and reckless driving. The writer also, his view is also that bad drivers need to be handled more seriously. He mentions about the police. He mentions about educating people. It's just really, 2 or 3 points that you can make about the writer's perspective. So just jot those down if you have time. And you should then make a few notes on the tone that the writer uses towards the subject matter. So the tone is the attitude towards the subject. So the writer's attitude towards this idea of cycling being affected by driving. So what is the writer's tone? I've just used that list that I handed out to you all a few weeks before the Easter break, 155 words that you can use to describe the writer's tone. I've just chosen a few from here. So I've said that he has quite a serious tone. He's also quite assertive in how he thinks drivers should be handled. He's a little bit critical. Now, I think it's important to avoid very exaggerated words here. He's not bitter, he's not vengeful, he's not spiteful. Critical is a good word that you can use here. When you're looking through that article of the different words you can use, really think to yourself, has he got a biting tone? Probably not. He's a little bit more toned down here. And then the fourth word that I have used is perturbed, which just means that he's worried. He seems to have this genuine worry for cyclists who are at risk to poor drivers. So those are your notes on that first article. Flip over now to source B, and you're going to do exactly the same thing again, but for this article. Obviously, the subject remains the same. It's about cyclists and driving, so I don't need to jot that down. The perspective, again, is very, very similar. So her viewpoint towards this is, perhaps a little bit more exaggerated compared to source A, but she is essentially saying that cyclists risk their lives at the hands of drivers. she's describing how the London streets, we get this sense that they're so busy. It's she uses a metaphor like a jungle. We don't need to jot that down now. But her perspective is essentially that, yes, cyclists are risking their lives every time they get on a bike. And she uses a very personal experience here to demonstrate that. So really similar. There might be some other things that you can jot down as well, but for time's sake, I'm going to move straight on to tone. So what kind of tone does she use to convey this attitude towards the subject matter of cycling? She's quite playful. This article seems a bit more light-hearted compared to source A. She talks about I cannot help feeling that cycling in the streets would be nicer, to use a mild expression, if he'd tried not to kill me. She's a bit more conversational. And a word that we can use to describe that is colloquial, if you use quite an everyday, familiar conversational tone. She's humorous. She definitely does use humour in this article. And she exaggerates quite a lot as well. And the word that we can use for this, which I'm sure that lots of you do know, is hyperbolic. The way that she describes certain things, just looking for a quick example now, perhaps when she's talking about the sandwich composed of a pedestrian, an omnibus, and herself, is quite overstated. It's a bit over the top at times. So I'm just going to write down that it's hyperbolic. And obviously I've used 4 different words to describe the tone for each of these sources, but you might just think of 1 or 2 before moving on. You've got to remember how much time you have. So a few notes on their perspective and their tone, which you can use later on. If you still have some time left and you've been a really speedy reader, then I would actually suggest making a few notes on the language analysis question for question number 3, which in this booklet gives you this paper gives you a certain line number to look at. And you can just have a very quick glance at the question. How does the writer use language to describe her first experiences of cycling? That's lines 8 to 18. So, and this is really only if you have time, just start to pick out a few language techniques for this question. So, I've thought about this already, so I'll do this very quickly. She's got the simile, as nervous as a hare. That's how she felt when she was setting off for her first trip on the bike. Obviously a simile showing how nervous she was. She makes the comparison to, the greyhound's breath, the people on the buses or the omnibuses around her, the horse-drawn carriages. If they're compared to a greyhound, that's suggesting that they're always in pursuit of her, they're chasing her. She's got this maybe quite almost like an adrenaline rush, being surrounded by these fast machines. Something else that I can see is a metaphor. So we've got the stormy oceans of Sloane Street. So you might just want to annotate that there's a metaphor there. Again, we get this sense of the chaos of the streets that she's surrounded by. She's overwhelmed, perhaps. And I can also see a hyperbole in a state bordering on collapse. This is how she feels when she returns from her first trip out. We might say that this is hyperbolic language. Does she really feel like she's weak at the knees, that she's going to collapse, or is she exaggerating for the purposes of this article, which is quite funny, quite entertaining. So you can just start making a few notes if you have the time, but I doubt that you will have the time to make a start on this. This is just for those, as I said, who are speedy readers and who have read through and comprehended everything before reaching this stage. All right, so that was just a little bit on planning if you have the time. In the next video, we'll just move on to the questions.